It is my pleasant duty to invite Master-elect of the Academy of Medicine Singapore, Dr. Teo Eng Kiong, to read the citation for our 24th Gordon Arthur Ransome Orator, Mr. George Yeo. Dr. Teo, please.
Our guest of honor, Mr. George Yeo, Master, Academy of Medicine Singapore, Master, Academy of Medicine Malaysia, Vice President, Hong Kong Academy of Medicine, fellow academicians, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great honor to introduce our 24th Gordon Arthur Ransome Orator for the 53rd Singapore Malaysian Congress for Medicine. And Mr. George Yeo is also our guest of honor. It is interesting to note that Mr. Yeo is closely associated with the countries represented by the tripartite and is indeed most apt to deliver the Gordon Arthur Ransome Oration. Let's talk about his association with Singapore. Mr. George Yeo was born in Singapore, a Singaporean, in 1954. He studied at St. Stephen's, St. Patrick's, and subsequently in St. Joseph Institution, and I may just get a bit of association because I also studied in St. Joseph's Institution. Mr. George Yeo topped the 1970 cohort for the O-level examination and went on to receive the President's Scholarship in 1973. That year was a year of very good vintage. There were 11 President's Scholars. 3 of them became cabinet ministers, of which Mr. George Yeo is one of them. There were also 3 very prominent doctors in that cohort as well. Mr. George Yeo was also awarded the very prestigious SAF Scholarship, and with both awards, he went on to study engineering in Christ's College, Cambridge. In 1976, true to his usual self, Mr. George Yeo graduated with a double first in engineering. As a responsible Singaporean, Mr. George Yeo returned to SAF to serve his bond. His versatility was evident very early in his career. He started as a signal officer and rose rapidly through the ranks. He attended the Singapore Command and Staff College in 1979, and being always on top of his challenges, he topped again this class. Thereafter, he switched from being a signal officer to the Republic of Singapore Air Force, where he subsequently assumed the position of Head Air Plans Department and thereafter headed the Joint Ops in our Ministry of Defense as a Brigadier General. In 1983, Mr. Yeo completed his MBA from Harvard with high distinction. Mr. George Yeo is renowned as a strategist. While in the military, he has led many war games at large-scale level and has subdued many prominent opponents, for which I will not mention the names. Mr. Yeo stepped into politics in 1988 and was Minister of Information and Arts from 1990 to 1999, Minister of Health 1994 to 1997, Trade and Industry 1999 to 2004, and Foreign Affairs 2004 to 2011. You will have realized that there were a lot of overlaps, and there were many times Mr. George Yeo wears several ministry hats. As the minister helming the ministries, Mr. George Yeo brought value, innovation, and transformation. Well, personally, as a citizen, I'm most impressed by his push for the transformation within the PAP, the political party which he belonged to. Well, we'll leave Singapore for a while, and we move to Malaysia. As a minister, Mr. George Yeo has many interactions with the neighboring countries, and Malaysia is our closest neighbor. There were good times and tough times, but it's often said that tough times bring out the best of an individual. Mr. Yeo was the Minister of Foreign Affairs during the negotiation and settlement of a very emotional issue, a small little white rock called Piedra Branca. Through this event, Mr. George Yeo showed his strength in diplomacy, as well as capability in negotiation, keeping good relations and holding fast to certain lines. Through the effort of him and his Malaysian counterpart, the issue was settled amicably, and today, Singapore and Malaysia remain as close neighbors and good friends. And once again, we want to welcome our Malaysian delegates to this meeting. Shortly after he stepped out of politics, Mr. Yeo was rapidly wooed by Malaysian tycoon, Mr. Robert Kwok, to add value to his business. In fact, word has it that Mr. George Yeo was given a job offer without a job description. How many of us have that opportunity? Okay, we'll go from Malaysia to Hong Kong. Mr. George Yeo's engagement with Mr. Kwok brought him to Carry Logistics, where he assumed the positions of chairman and executive director in August 2012. Mr. Yeo was based in Hong Kong and traveled frequently in the region. And through these years, he has indeed brought much value to that organization. In April 2019, Mr. George Yeo announced his stepping down as the chairman as well as executive director of Carry. His reasons for stepping down remains an aspiration for many of us here. That is, to spend more time with his wife and his children. From Mr. Yeo's experience in educational institutions like Cambridge and Harvard, the high-level decisions made at military, political office, as well as large commercial corporations, we certainly have much to learn from him today. It's my honor to present to you our 24th Gordon Arthur Ransome Orator, Mr. George Yeo, with the topic, Human Solidarity in a Fragmenting World. Mr. George Yeo, please.
It is now with greatest honor that I invite Mr. George Yeo to deliver the 24th Gordon Arthur Ransome Oration entitled Human Solidarity in a Fragmenting World. Mr. Yeo, please.
Dr. Sampanadan, Professor Rosmawati Mohammed, Professor Gilberto Leong, members of the Academies of Medicine of Singapore, Malaysia, and Hong Kong, fellows, old and young, friends, family members, relatives, ladies and gentlemen. I first heard of Professor Ransome from my elder brother, Peter. Peter is 7 years my senior. When he was in medical school, I was in secondary school and shared a room with him in our old house at East Coast Terrace. He would often tell me stories about this remarkable English physician who could diagnose diseases accurately, often based only on observation, palpation, and even by smell. When Dr. Sampanadan asked me early last year if I could deliver the Gordon Arthur Ransome Oration, I resonated immediately, my mind going back to stories I heard a long time ago. I thank the Singapore Academy of Medicine for giving me this signal honor. This oration was originally planned to be held in Hong Kong last December in conjunction with an event co-organized by the three academies. Unfortunately, the event had to be cancelled because of the unsettled situation in Hong Kong. No one expected the protests, which began in June last year in Hong Kong, to become so big and to last so long. As a legislator of many years myself, I decided to download the extradition bill and read it. And frankly, I did not find the proposed amendments to existing laws unreasonable. It did not seem right that one could commit rape or murder in China and find sanctuary in Hong Kong. However, most Hong Kongers viewed the bill differently and were outraged that Chief Executive Carrie Lam was determined to get it passed despite mass opposition. Looking back, the bill was only the spark that set off a forest fire. For many years after the return of Hong Kong to China in 1987, the fuel load in the forest had been building up. Social injustice had gotten worse. Most parents in Hong Kong no longer believed that their children could do better than them. As a result, there's not a sense of hope. And without a sense of hope, society turns sour. The lack of affordable housing in Hong Kong is egregious. During colonial times, the Hong Kong civil service was conditioned to take instructions from London. The British approach was to govern firmly, but lightly, unless the core interests were affected, leaving people to fend for themselves. After 1997, Beijing left Hong Kong to govern itself, not giving instructions the way London did. However, the Hong Kong administration changed little, vested interests remained comfortably in place, and political leadership was lacking. Hong Kong has a well-developed social and economic establishment, but not a political establishment. Under the British, it was not desirable that Hong Kong should have its own political culture. Perhaps China should have been more interventionist after 1997, but for a variety of reasons, including the selfish interests of groups from the mainland, which found Hong Kong's separate status convenient, China left things be. Worse, the people of Hong Kong had to struggle with an identity crisis. Older Hong Kongers had left the mainland during earlier periods of upheaval and distrusted Beijing. 1949, the Great Leap Forward, the Great Famines of the early 60s, the Cultural Revolution, and June 4th. The majority of teachers in Hong Kong, from primary 1 to university, are anti-mainland and pass prejudices against China, especially against the Communist Party, onto their charges. To be a student leader in university, you have to honor June 4th. Most Hong Kongers know that they cannot be independent, but many prefer not to identify themselves as Chinese citizens. And at the top, they hold multiple passports. When Deng Xiaoping proposed one country, two systems, the precondition for it to work was that Hong Kongers must not only love Hong Kong, they must also love China. 一国两制，爱国爱港，港人治港。That was the sequence. In fact, loving China should come first, but it will take time and much effort for that to be put right. National education in Hong Kong has been neglected for too long. After leaving government in 2011, I joined Robert Kwok in Hong Kong. My wife and I shuttled back and forth between the two cities. In fact, we just came back a few hours ago from Hong Kong. Hong Kong has become for us a second home. We now have our own social circle there, including a number of young Hong Kongers interested in politics who sought me out. Some of them are yellow, some are blue, but all feel deeply for Hong Kong. We ourselves have developed an affection for Hong Kong and its people, and decided after my retirement as chairman of Carrier Logistics last year to buy an apartment near Hong Kong University. Like many others, we were shocked by the rapid deterioration of Hong Kong in the last 8 months. Unlike many others, we remain cautiously optimistic for Hong Kong's long-term future because of its special position, half in and half out of China, and the resilience of its people. It's, however, not my intention this afternoon to talk principally about Hong Kong. The reason for my raising Hong Kong is because there are larger, deeper forces at work in Hong Kong which affect the entire world. We have to be mindful of them because these forces affect us in Singapore also. And these are forces unleashed by technology which challenge us morally. I would like to highlight four in particular: the social media revolution, fragmentation and reconfiguration of human society, growing wealth and income inequality, and mass manipulation by new masters of the universe. First, the social media revolution. When the internet arrived in the 90s, many saw it as liberating. It became much easier to access information. Patients have already Googled their symptoms before seeing doctors, and everything the doctor said and prescribed could be counter-checked on the net, although sometimes a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. In the same way, teachers are constantly challenged by students, and government leaders by the citizenry. At home, parents have come to accept that for many things and in many areas, they have to rely on their children for information and advice. The social media has disrupted all relationships. Everywhere, we see hierarchies breaking down. All institutions, once preserved and sustained by ritual, secrecy, information asymmetry, by hypocrisy, deception, and force, are being eroded. Traditional leaders are dragged down from their ivory towers and shown to be quite ordinary and fallible after all. The hypocrisy and corruption exposed by ubiquitous cameras and microphones. When Pope Francis smacked an Asian lady twice on the arm after she grabbed him by his sleeve in St. Peter's Square and refused to let go, it immediately became news all over the world. The Pope quickly apologized the day after for setting a bad example. A mainland Chinese friend of mine messaged me to say, hey, he actually made the Pope look quite good because it showed him to be human. It is just as well that Francis, since becoming Pope, frequently declares himself a sinner. All leadership models have become obsolete. Whether it is Pope Francis, President Donald Trump, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, Elon Musk, or Greta Thunberg, we are in a new situation. It sometimes seems as if a necessary qualification for leadership is to be publicly a sinner. The term used nowadays is authenticity, although that too is often manufactured. Human society takes time to adjust to new technologies. The IT revolution shows no sign of abating. In fact, it is setting off concomitant change in other technological fields like biomedicine, material science, and manufacturing. And these changes, in turn, act and react upon one another, often in unexpected and surprising ways, causing even further disruption to the old order. In his analysis of economic cycles, the Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter wrote about creative destruction. What we see all around is a destructive phase of the technological revolution, which is fragmenting human society. This fragmentation, which is the second force I'm highlighting today, defines the age we live in. Going back to Hong Kong, what characterizes the protest movement is its fluid, leaderless, organic character. The social media reinforces beliefs and biases. Those who are yellow watch yellow sites, get angrier, and become more yellow. For many, police officers have become the villains, and even their family members are targeted. For those who are blue, the demonstrators are cockroaches to be smacked down. Views become highly, absurdly polarized. We hear of couples breaking up, and parents who are no longer able to talk to their children. Unmediated positive feedback loops quickly become unstable. The same phenomenon is evident in the US today, in Taiwan during the recent elections, the UK where the Brexit debate was raging, and in many other countries. Fragmentation, however, is not the end state. Gradually, the fragments recombine in new ways, similar to the pattern of neural networks. Nodes grow and compete with other nodes, with which they are linked through multiple pathways. There's a biological quality about these new forms of organization. It is almost as if we are witnessing a new Cambrian explosion of diverse organizational species. Those which successfully adapt to the new environment proliferate, while others reach dead ends. Apple, Samsung, and Huawei have very different organizational structures and systems. Which among them will still be successful 10 years from now, no one can foretell. But for sure, there'll be new winners and losers. Losing faith in existing institutions. There's at one level a reversion to tribal networks of trust. Some of these networks are based on ethnicity and religion. Some years ago, Joel Kotkin, in his book Tribes, wrote about the tribal networks which undergird global commerce like those of Mormons, Jews, Jaffna Tamils, Parsis, Jains, Armenians, Lebanese, and Chinese. And among the Chinese, there are regional networks which stand out, like the Wenzhou Connection. We also see new tribal networks forming around specific causes, such as LGBT rights, climate activism, even veganism. And there's an obvious negative side to this phenomenon. Networks like Al-Qaeda and ISIS have similar morphologies, but are destructive. Anti-Semitism has also become more pronounced, fueled by groups which corroborate each other's prejudices on the internet, sometimes in the dark net. Positive or negative, politicians everywhere are quick to pick up populist causes to win votes, undermining the civil society, which should be the bedrock of democratic society. Political systems are subject to the same creative destruction. Western democratic systems no longer function well. Long-established political parties are fissuring. In many democracies, domestic political debate have become toxic. The seeming success of China's system is an affront to Western liberal democrats. China's authoritarian communism is not supposed to work well. Yet, it has raised hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and enabled the country to join the front rank of nations in many fields, causing the US to view it now as a strategic threat. China sees its own system as unique and does not seek to export it to others. But China's relative success does give hope and heart to many developing countries that there are other ways to the future. They do not have to take the path of Western liberal democracies. I say relative success because China too faces enormous challenges. Political systems and organizations have to evolve. And if they don't, they become dysfunctional and unstable. Thus, at all levels, from the family to companies to political structures, we see continuing fragmentation, experimentation, and reconfiguration. It is a process which can be described as Darwinian. The third force impacting society today is growing wealth and income inequality. Wealth and income inequality in Hong Kong is an important underlying cause of the current unrest. According to a recent study by the Asian Competitiveness Institute at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, the inequality in Hong Kong has gotten worse in recent years. Without a strong injection of socialism, Hong Kong society will remain fractured. The problem is worldwide and not confined to Hong Kong. the impact of technological change on individual fortunes is uneven. Once upon a time, hardworking, responsible employees could expect their lives to improve year by year. Today, many feel they are struggling to run up a downward moving escalator. Those whose work are repetitive are at great risk. Their jobs can be outsourced to countries where labor is cheaper, or be replaced by robots and algorithms. In contrast, those who are well placed to seize new opportunities created by fragmentation, they prosper. For example, among new graduates, computer engineers command among the highest salaries. Many companies remain stuck in the past. Those who are able to disrupt them become rich and are lionized, even though on the wayside, we see many casualties. When we look at the league table of the most successful companies in the world, the top positions are increasingly held by those in technology. In Singapore, SEA, which is a company specializing in gaming and e-commerce, a company which most Singaporeans have not heard of, has quite suddenly become one of the top companies with a capitalization half that of Singapore Telecoms. The flood of global liquidity released by central bankers after the global financial crisis has unfairly benefited a relatively small group of privileged companies and individuals, accentuating wealth and income inequality in the world. Those who are well connected to governments and to wealthy families, especially in tech and high finance, are able to access cheap money, while the great majority of small and medium enterprises pay higher interest rates. Inflation in asset prices have skewed wealth further to those who are already wealthy. In many developing countries, those already invested in asset classes like property get richer, while the rest struggle to buy their first home. And this is being perpetuated down one generation. Many successful startups are founded by young men and women who are themselves scions of wealthy, well-connected families. Growing inequality of wealth and income exacerbates existing class and ethnic divisions in society. In many countries, large groups resent being systematically disadvantaged and left behind. And this frustration, though still inchoate, has become widespread. The Yellow Jacket protests in France are part of this phenomenon. And there are eerie similarities between the protests in Hong Kong and those far away in Barcelona and in Santiago. The fourth force challenging us is the way big data and the social media are being used to manipulate the way we think. The first phase of the internet revolution opened the floodgates to information access and eroded old power structures. For a short while, there was an exhilarating sense of equalization. That phase has ended. We're increasingly discovering how our minds are being manipulated by new masters of the universe. Companies like Amazon, Google, Facebook, Alibaba, and Tencent make use of the enormous data they collect to squeeze out competitors and influence our preferences, often without our knowledge, let alone our consent. In Singapore and elsewhere, a very high percentage of ad revenues is cornered by Google and Facebook because of the eyeballs they have captured. A few weeks after the Hong Kong unrest started, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, in quick succession, blocked hundreds of sites which they claim besmirched protesters, giving the reason that these sites originated from China. Sites which supported the protesters were untouched. It's unclear who made these decisions, and I don't think they were made in Hong Kong. But there's no doubt that the way friction is increased or reduced in different parts of the internet can significantly sway public opinion. Trapped in an old mindset, the Hong Kong government was unable or unwilling to intervene. Other governments have no such inhibitions. India routinely shuts down the internet in various cities when there are riots. Kashmir was denied the internet for months, a decision which the Indian Supreme Court judged unlawful just a few days ago. When mass demonstrations erupted in Iran after fuel prices were raised, the government switched off Facebook, causing Secretary Pompeo to threaten sanctions on those responsible for shutting it down. In the battle for hearts and minds in Iran, the US actively intervenes in the way Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram cover developments in the country. Sympathetic coverage of General Soleimani has been systematically blocked. The big powers devote considerable resources to the exploitation of the social media for political purposes. Domestically, they may be restricted, constrained by national law. Externally, there are no restrictions. In 2013, Edward Snowden revealed the existence of PRISM, an incredible system developed by the US National Security Agency to collect internet information worldwide. The US could eavesdrop on private conversation by Chancellor Merkel on her mobile phone. All governments would love to have such a capability, but none can hope to, and certainly not on the same scale as the US, except possibly China one day. A key reason for the US campaign against Huawei is the fear that China may not only develop a similar surveillance capability, but Chinese equipment and systems will make it harder for the US to maintain the same surveillance reach. For small countries like Singapore, the only safe assumption is that all systems expose us to external intelligence penetration. We have to find ways to protect ourselves and accept that nothing is foolproof. The challenge is made much harder with increasing dependence on clouds. China makes no pretense about controlling the internet. President Xi Jinping himself declared that the development of the internet is an integral part of national development and not separate from it. All internet providers in China accept the leadership of the Communist Party. They have no choice. In fact, China is probably the first country to make extensive use of big data for national governance. Big data analysis has enabled China to overcome a problem which afflicted its governance system over the centuries. Because of the size of the country and its population, there are many layers of administration, making it hard for Beijing to know what's happening on the ground. Corrupt officials often succeed in covering up problems by working with their counterparts one level up to suppress complaints. Some of you might have watched Zhang Yimou's movie, 出击打官司, which tells a very interesting story about how officials operate classically in China. To overcome this defect, Chinese dynasties developed elaborate systems of inspection from the imperial court. Wrongs do get righted, but they're so rare, the stories are immortalized in Chinese operas. With big data analysis, it is easier for Beijing to be alerted earlier. Information systems monitor the overall shape of data. When there are signs of inflammation, Beijing zooms in to find out what's happening. Once lower-level officials know that it is hard to cover up, they behave better. In fact, security agencies like the NSA use similar methods to spot potential terrorist attacks by monitoring internet chatter on Islamic sites. In Xinjiang, China is criticized by Western and Muslim countries for the way information is collected and used, including the mass deployment of facial recognition. Whether the Chinese method of curbing terrorism is more effective than the Western method of acting forcefully only when the evidence has become clear is still an open question. The difference is not unlike the methods used for treating cancer. The Western method of tackling terrorism is akin to surgery and chemotherapy, like the use of predator drones to kill terrorists. The Chinese method is to treat the body politic holistically, like what Chinese Singsays do, gradually boosting its immunity. But we know in immunotherapy that you need patience and you need deep understanding of the problem for it to work. For many Westerners, China has become George Orwell's 1984. For many Chinese, the loss of privacy is a price worth paying for safety and convenience. There's probably no safer big country than China today. But will the centralization of control lead to massive abuse one day? The Chinese Communist Party is not immune to the same forces of change in the world. And it has to evolve in response to new circumstances. By cracking down on corruption and re-establishing moral authority, President Xi Jinping has bought time for China and the Communist Party. And there's a strange parallel between what President Xi has been doing in China and what Pope Francis has been doing in the Vatican to reduce corruption, reduce hierarchy, reassert moral authority by being close to the flock. Pope Francis has a wonderful phrase that you can only be a good shepherd if you smell of the sheep. And that's what Xi Jinping, if you watch the way he presents himself in Chinese media, tries to do. And this year in 2020 is a year when they have declared the abolition of abject poverty in all of China, which is a historic achievement. In the US, what intelligence and law enforcement agencies are allowed to do is the subject of a raging debate. Trump has railed against fake news from the time of his presidential campaign. Is the deep state out of control? Well, it depends on whom you ask. There's also growing reaction against the big tech companies. Democratic candidate Elizabeth Warren is campaigning for their breakup, which alarms Mark Zuckerberg. Warren is a policy wonk and has thought through the implications of such a move. In Europe, the General Data Protection Regulation, commonly known as GDPR, came to force 2 years ago. It provides some safeguard to the misuse or abuse of data collection. So if you stay in a hotel in Europe, you're asked, would you allow your presence in the hotel to be made known to others? Would you allow someone else to call you in the room? And you've got to state all this in writing. It's part of GDPR. This may make it more difficult, however, for Europe to catch up with the US and China in AI, a point which concerns many European leaders. The use of facial recognition technology, however, is not likely to be held back because it is simply too useful. Thus, we see in the world today a range of responses to the challenge of big data, in particular the loss of privacy and the mass manipulation of public opinion. In Singapore, the Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act, commonly known as POFMA, is a brave attempt to stem the same incoming tide. It's not easy, but we should not stop trying. The revolution in IT is enabling the collection, storage, and processing of data on an unprecedented scale without theoretical limit. It's almost as if nothing that happens will ever be forgotten again. In China, to ensure better disease control, there's an effort to recognize every pig, either facially or from the back. The pig population in China is about 500 million. For computer engineers, this is a trivial problem. Every detail of every human being on the planet living today and in the future will eventually be monitored, recorded, and analyzed. And with AI, his probable behavior and disease pattern will also be known. It is a scary prospect. This leap in the collective intelligence of human beings has a godlike quality about it. There does not seem to be any phenomenon which we cannot, as a species, potentially understand. That which the technological revolution has unleashed is, however, two-edged. There's always a temptation, an unstoppable temptation, to weaponize the newest technology in order to gain military advantage. In the biological world, you either produce or you take away from someone else what he has produced. Anything which lives must solve the dual challenge of production and security, which is what Darwin taught us in the 19th century, natural selection. Thus, every new technology is used both for creation and destruction, and therefore for both good and evil. It takes time for the moral sense of human beings to catch up with new technologies and to tame them. In the last century, mechanization, mass production, and nuclear energy led to the slaughter of over 100 million people. Terrible slaughter in war, in famine. Whether we will be wiser in this century is still an open question. There's an air of hubris in the way the new masters of the universe view their capabilities. This hubris infects us at all levels. State agencies, which are carried away by the use of technology, politicians who rely on clever data analytics to manipulate voters, generals who fantasize unstoppable spears and impregnable shields, economists who believe that the manipulation of money supply can rid us of economic cycles, corporate leaders whose ambitions know no bounds, successful tribes and wealthy individuals who are convinced of their own genetic superiority, scientists who tinker with germlines to improve the quality of human beings, and computer engineers who see AI as the ultimate. It is said that in Roman times, a victorious general, in the triumphal procession through Rome, would have behind him a slave, whispering into his ears repeatedly, "Memento mori." Memento mori, which means in Latin, remember you will die. It is a warning against hubris, a call to humility and restraint when one is successful and all chuffed up. Whether as parents, teachers, doctors, government ministers, or corporate leaders, we must therefore not lose our moral sense in the pursuit of achievement and success. It's always important to contemplate human weakness and the meaning of suffering and death. For it is in pathos that we forge the sense of a group. In an age of fragmentation, solidarity is vital. In everything we do, we must not ignore those who are wounded, who have failed, who have fallen by the wayside. Because without this social glue, civilized society breaks down. It's almost as if tectonic shift has caused the old edifices to crumble into small pieces. We have to rebuild, but with the expectation that the ground will continue to quake. and therefore we need smaller, simpler structures, which are flexibly linked to one another, like those in a Middle Eastern souk. Above all, we need solidarity, which is the instinct to connect and to bond. Human society cannot be organized on the basis of law and the market alone. Laws only mark out external boundaries. Laws can require parents to look after children, but laws cannot make parents love their children, or vice versa. The market is a powerful way of allocating resources in a complex economy, but the market alone cannot solve many problems. We're all familiar with Adam Smith's invisible hand, but we often forget that Adam Smith was first and foremost a moral philosopher. Take the healthcare system, for example. If doctors are only bound to their patients by the money nexus, many diseases will be poorly treated or mistreated, however clever AI systems become. Human society needs solidarity as a cohesive force to bind human beings together in cooperative effort. In traditional Confucius teaching, stress is put on 5 core values. 仁义礼智信. 仁义礼智信. In the 3-character classic, the San Tzu Jing, it says, 乐仁义礼智信, 则无常不容忍. Little kids learn that deity. Broadly speaking, 仁, benevolence, 义, justice, 礼, proper behavior, 智, wisdom, 信, trust, or truth. All moral systems incorporate and elaborate these values. They are deep in our nature, probably encoded in our DNA. In order to remain relevant, moral systems, which include all religions and ideologies, must adapt to new challenges thrown up by technology. But there are deep constants. Take Li, or proper behavior, as an example. For human beings to interact, we need protocols facilitating communication and cooperation. When individuals are masked, whether in public or on the internet, protocols are hard to establish. In anonymous settings, individuals quickly become irresponsible and abusive. Civilized behavior requires behavioral responses which are generally agreed to and predictable for a discourse to be possible. And interestingly, it is protocols like TCP/IP which makes the internet, the World Wide Web, possible in the first place. The fact of the matter is, there can be no freedom without accountability. Without a moral sense, the new freedom which technology offers destroys itself. At the heart of the Hong Kong crisis is a moral crisis. In 7 months, in 8 months, how society reveals an uglier side of hatred, of a refusal to recognize wrongs done by one side or the other, a desire for revenge, a disregard for simple values of decency, compassion, protection of life and limb. 2 nights ago in Hong Kong, I had dinner with Gary Wong, a young Hong Kong political leader whom I've known for some years. Together with Jasper Chang, former president of LegCo, and Raymond Mack, another young political leader whom I had dinner with the night Polly Yu was encircled. They and 5 others decided in the late evening of 18 November to enter PolyU, which was then under siege by Hong Kong police, in order to persuade the few hundred remaining die-hard protesters to leave. They made the decision after receiving a WhatsApp message from a young girl in PolyU with a heart-rending plea for help. After consulting government leaders, the police agreed for the group to enter, but on the signed understanding that the police could not ensure their safety. And indeed, when they crossed the barricades, they were greeted by arrows on the draw pointed at them. The campus was a war zone. They were shocked that among the protesters were many who were well-educated, some from well-to-do families. And there were many young girls, some only 12 years old. Happily, they succeeded in persuading some 70 protesters to leave. There were loud cheers when they came out, not only by the crowd outside PolyU, but by many all over Hong Kong watching the drama unfold on television and the social media. Chief Executive Carrie Lam decided wisely that those below the age of 18 could go home once they had their names registered. The polarization in Hong Kong had reached a point where protesters who wanted to leave did not believe they could trust the authorities to honor their words. The majority of Hong Kong youth today has developed a visceral antipathy towards the Hong Kong police. And yet it was not long ago when the Hong Kong police was rated among the best in the world and the subject of many Hong Kong movies, Cantonese movies. And from the other side, among many in authority and the older generation, there's anger, disappointment, and grief vis-a-vis a younger generation which had seemingly turned wayward. It will take time to clean the wounds and for the wounds to heal. China has dispatched former Party Secretary of Qinghai and Shanxi, Luo Huining, to Hong Kong. He's new to Hong Kong and will bring a fresh mind to bear on the problems. You have to work with Hong Kong leaders who showed courage, moral courage, and wisdom during the recent crisis to restore solidarity in Hong Kong and between Hong Kong and the mainland. In all fields, we need moral leadership. The great danger today is a revolution in technology outpacing the evolution of our moral sense, whether in the public, private, or public sector, or people sector. In grappling with economic and technical questions, we should never de-emphasize moral considerations. It's common nowadays for decisions to be taken in an amoral way, based on administrative and technical considerations. An indifferent, amoral approach in the period of rapid technological change is possibly the greatest danger to humankind today. And we must not be beguiled by a so-called post-truth world. The more complex the world becomes, the more must we affirm that which is at the core of our humanity. And the human quality of Professor Gordon Arthur Ransome, as described by Professor Seah Cheng Xiang, is therefore worth recalling. He's always ready to render a helping hand when a fellow doctor himself is in trouble. He has an ever-constant ear, which is itself a therapy. Time appears to him to be of no consequence when it comes to giving it to someone else. The distress talks on, and he listens. A few careful chosen words of advice now and then provides the panacea. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yeo, for a very powerful and insightful lecture. We'd like you to be on stage. We'd like you to be on stage to receive the Gordon Arthur Ransome Gold Medal from Master. Master, please. Thank you, Master. Thank you, Mr. Yu.